For most of recorded human history, the intelligence of birds has been treated as a contradiction in terms, a category error so obvious that it barely required argument. The very phrase bird brain, embedded so deeply in the English language that most people deploy it without a moment's reflection on its origins, encapsulates a folk wisdom that seemed, for centuries, to rest on perfectly solid scientific foundations. Birds had small brains. Intelligence required large brains. Therefore, birds were not intelligent. The syllogism was clean, the conclusion was satisfying, and it was wrong in ways so fundamental and so far-reaching that the scientific community is still working through the full implications of its wrongness, more than 2 decades after the initial cracks in the consensus began to appear, and years after those cracks widened into fractures that have now effectively demolished the theoretical framework that produced them. Crows, ravens, jays, and the other members of the corvid family, a group of birds distributed across virtually every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, from the Arctic tundra to the subtropical forests of Southeast Asia, from the high Himalayan passes to the urban centers of North America and Europe, have emerged from decades of increasingly sophisticated cognitive research as the animals most responsible for forcing that demolition. They have done so not by fitting neatly into existing frameworks for understanding animal intelligence, but by consistently and almost perversely refusing to do so, by demonstrating cognitive capabilities that the frameworks said they should not have, by solving problems that the frameworks said they could not solve, and by displaying forms of mental sophistication that the frameworks had explicitly reserved for species with the kind of large, structurally complex brains that crows conspicuously do not possess. The corvid family itself is worth pausing on because its sheer diversity is part of what makes the cognitive story so compelling. The family Corvidae includes more than 120 species, not just the familiar American crow and the common raven, but jackdaws, rooks, magpies, jays of dozens of varieties, choughs and nutcrackers spread across every continent except Antarctica. Some, like the New Caledonian crow, evolved in geographic isolation on remote islands with unusual ecological pressures. Others, like the American crow and the carrion crow, have adapted with striking success to the chaos of human cities. This diversity matters because it means corvid intelligence is not a fluke confined to one unusual species, but a recurring evolutionary outcome appearing again and again across a family that diverged into its component lineages tens of millions of years ago. When the same suite of abilities shows up independently in ravens in Austria, New Caledonian crows in the South Pacific, and jackdaws in English church towers, the parsimonious explanation is not coincidence. It is that something about the corvid lineage's ecology and sociality has repeatedly selected for exactly the kind of flexible, self-monitoring intelligence the older frameworks insisted birds could not possess. The research findings published in 2023 and continuing into 2024 represent the most recent and, in several respects, the most significant chapter in this ongoing story of scientific revision, not because they represent a clean break from what came before, but because they have pushed the investigation of corvid cognition into domains of inquiry that would have seemed not merely premature, but almost absurd to suggest even 15 years ago. What the most recent wave of research has documented, with methodological rigor and reproducible results that are now generating serious engagement from the broader neuroscience community, is evidence that crows possess something that the scientific literature had treated as the exclusive cognitive property of humans and, with certain qualifications, of the great apes, a capacity for conscious, deliberate metacognitive awareness of their own mental states. Not mere intelligence in the sense of flexible problem solving, not mere memory in the sense of retaining useful information, but something approaching genuine self-awareness, the ability to know what they know, to recognize the limits of their own knowledge, and to adjust their behavior accordingly in ways that reflect an internal monitoring of their own cognitive processes. To understand why this finding carries the significance that it does, why it has moved from the specialized literature of comparative cognition into the broader conversation about the nature of mind and consciousness, requires understanding something about the long and complicated history of how scientists have thought about animal intelligence and about the specific theoretical assumptions that corvid research has been systematically dismantling for the past quarter century. The dominant framework for understanding animal intelligence through most of the 20th century was one in which cognitive sophistication was understood as a direct and largely linear function of brain size and structural complexity, with the human brain at the apex of a hierarchy in which other species occupied positions determined primarily by how closely their neural architecture resembled our own. This framework had genuine scientific grounding. The correlation between encephalization quotient, a measure of brain size relative to body size, and behavioral flexibility is real and has been documented across a wide range of species. But it was a framework whose predictive, Power was considerably more limited than its dominance in the field suggested, and it carried embedded assumptions about the relationship between brain structure and cognitive function that the emerging field of comparative neuroscience has progressively dismantled. This is not to say the framework emerged from nowhere or that it was held only by careless thinkers. The scaling relationship between brain size and cognitive ability does hold up reasonably well within certain taxonomic groups, among primates, for instance, and the temptation to extend that relationship across the entire animal kingdom, treating it as a universal law rather than a group-specific pattern, was an understandable scientific error rather than a willful one. The error became entrenched. However, because it aligned conveniently with a broader cultural narrative about human exceptionalism, one in which the size and complexity of the human brain was treated not merely as one adaptation among many, but as the capstone of a hierarchy of being, with humans at the top, other mammals arranged below according to their resemblance to us, and birds, reptiles, and everything else relegated to a category of mere instinct-driven automata. Crows, inconveniently, kept doing things that did not fit that category. The specific assumption most relevant to understanding corvid intelligence is the one that located the neurological basis of higher cognitive function in the neocortex, the six-layered outer region of the mammalian brain that expanded dramatically during primate evolution and that reached its greatest relative size in the human brain. The neocortex, and in particular the prefrontal cortex that forms its anterior portion, was understood as the seat of executive function, working memory, planning, self-monitoring, and the other high-level cognitive processes that distinguish human cognition from that of simpler animals. The assumption followed naturally. Animals without a neocortex cannot have the cognitive capabilities that the neocortex supports. Birds do not have a neocortex. Therefore, birds cannot have those capabilities. The problem with this assumption was not its identification of the neocortex as important for higher cognition in mammals. That identification was well supported and remains valid. The problem was the implicit further step of treating the neocortex as the only possible neural substrate for those capabilities, rather than as one specific evolutionary solution to the problem of implementing certain cognitive functions. Birds, it turns out, solve that same evolutionary problem differently, not by developing a layered cortical structure, but by developing a different organizational principle for their forebrain, one that packs neurons with comparable functional connectivity into a different architectural arrangement. The avian pallium, the forebrain region in birds that is homologous in evolutionary origin to the mammalian cortex, implements cognitive functions through a nuclear rather than laminar organization, clustering neurons into discrete processing units rather than layers. But achieving through that different architecture, a functional sophistication that behavioral research has now demonstrated approaches, or in some domains, equals the cognitive capabilities supported by the mammalian neocortex. There's a further wrinkle in this story that has only become widely appreciated in recent years, and it concerns neuron density rather than neuron organization alone. Research conducted by Susanna Herculano-Hausel and her collaborators, using a cell counting technique pioneered for estimating absolute neuron numbers across species, found that the forebrains of corvids and parrots pack neurons at a density considerably higher than that found in most mammals, including many primates. A crow's walnut-sized brain, despite its modest absolute size, contains a number of forebrain neurons comparable to, or in some cases exceeding the number found in monkeys with substantially larger brains. This finding reframes the entire question. The relevant variable for cognitive capacity may not be brain size in any absolute or relative sense, but the raw number of information, processing units packed into the forebrain, and the density of their interconnections. And on that metric, the corvid brain is not a diminished version of a mammalian brain. It is, in its own currency, remarkably rich. This neurobiological understanding was significantly advanced by research published in the early 2000s, particularly the landmark work that led to a formal renaming of avian brain regions to reflect their actual homology with mammalian structures, rather than the older nomenclature that had misleadingly characterized avian forebrain regions as primitive and reptilian. The old terminology, terms like archistriatum, borrowed from a now discredited model in which the avian forebrain was understood as little more than an enlarged basal ganglia, a structure associated in mammals with relatively simple, instinct-driven behavior, had actively obscured the true nature of these structures for the better part of a century. The 2005 consensus statement that formally revised this nomenclature, produced by an international consortium of avian neuroanatomists, was as much a correction of language as of science, but it mattered enormously because the old terms had shaped 2 generations of researchers' intuitions about what birds could even be capable of before a single experiment was run. But the behavioral research that had already been accumulating for decades before that revision was what had made it necessary. It was the behavior of crows and their relatives that had forced the neuroscience to catch up, not the other way around. The behavioral literature on corvid cognition begins in earnest with studies conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, many of them focusing on the western scrub jay, now known as the California scrub jay, and its remarkable food caching behavior. Scrub jays cache food obsessively, storing tens of thousands of individual food items in separate locations across their territories and retrieving those caches with accuracy that demands a sophisticated episodic memory far beyond what the existing frameworks predicted. A single scrub jay, over the course of a single autumn, may create several thousand individual caches scattered across an area of several hectares, hiding food not in a small number of large stockpiles, but in a vast, deliberately decentralized network of tiny deposits, a strategy that only makes sense if the animal retains a correspondingly vast and precise memory for where each deposit was made. Otherwise, the food would simply be lost, scattered and forgotten across the landscape, providing no benefit at all to the bird that cached it. The initial response to this observation was to seek simpler explanations. Perhaps the jays were using olfactory cues, or were retrieving caches through a form of associative conditioning that required no genuine episodic memory. Methodical, experimental. Elimination of these alternative explanations, conducted primarily by Nicola Clayton and her colleagues at Cambridge University across the late 1990s and into the 2000s, demonstrated conclusively that scrub jays possess what Clayton termed episodic-like memory, the ability to remember not merely where they cached food items, but what specific items they cached and when they cached them. The what-where-when structure of episodic memory had previously been treated as a uniquely human form of memory. The scrub jay research established that at minimum a functionally equivalent form of it existed in a bird with a brain the size of a walnut. Clayton's team allowed jays to cache both food types and then tested their retrieval choices after varying delays. When the delay was short, the jays preferentially recovered the caches containing the preferred but perishable larvae. When the delay was long enough that the larvae would have decayed, the jays switched their preference and recovered the peanut caches instead, effectively avoiding caches they themselves had calculated would now contain rotten, unappetizing food. This behavior could not be explained by simple habit or by any associative rule that did not incorporate a representation of elapsed time combined with knowledge of the perishability of the specific food item cached at a specific location, which is to say, it could not be explained without invoking something functionally indistinguishable from an episodic memory that tracked what was hidden, where it was hidden, and when. The cache studies produced a further finding that was arguably even more significant than the episodic memory result. When scrub jays were observed during caching by a competitor, another jay that could potentially steal the cached food later, their subsequent caching behavior changed in ways that clearly reflected an understanding of the competitor's perspective. Jays that had been observed caching would later return and move their caches to new locations, but only if the observing competitor had actually seen where the original cache was made. If the competitor had been present but facing away, the caches were left undisturbed. This sensitivity to what the competitor had and had not observed is a behavioral signature of theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states, including perceptual states like seeing, to other individuals. Theory of mind had been another cognitive capability, explicitly reserved for humans and, with some debate, for the great apes. The scrub jay research inserted a bird into that conversation in ways that the field could not ignore. This finding was extended further by subsequent research, showing that jays who had themselves stolen another bird's caches in the past, jays with personal experience of being a thief, were considerably more likely to recache their food after being observed than jays without such experience, a pattern suggesting the birds were drawing on something resembling experiential self-knowledge, projecting their own capacity for theft onto the intentions of the observing bird. It takes a thief to know a thief, as Clayton and her colleagues memorably summarized the finding. A bird that can reason, "I would steal from this cache if I were in the observer's position," is engaging in a form of perspective taking that requires representing not just what another individual has perceived, but what it might be motivated to do as a consequence. The New Caledonian crow subsequently became the focus of an entirely separate line of research that produced equally dramatic revisions to prevailing assumptions, this time concerning tool use and causal reasoning. New Caledonian crows manufacture and use tools in the wild, a behavior documented, with particular richness in their home islands in the South Pacific, where they craft hooked tools from plant stems and barbed tools from leaves to extract insects from crevices that their beaks cannot reach. Field studies of wild New Caledonian crows have documented an additional layer of sophistication that laboratory work alone could not capture. Regional variation in tool design that closely resembles the cultural transmission of techniques seen in human tool-making traditions. Crows in different valleys and on different islands within the species range make tools of measurably different shapes and styles, even when raw materials are similar, and young crows appear to learn the local style from observing older, more experienced birds rather than reinventing tool designs from scratch each generation. The most celebrated of these experiments involved a crow named Betty, who, in 2002, spontaneously bent a piece of straight wire into a hook in order to retrieve a food-containing bucket from a vertical tube, a solution that required not merely insight into the mechanical relationship between the hook shape and the retrieval task, but active fabrication of a tool with the required properties from an unsuitable starting material. Betty had never seen a hooked wire before and had not been trained to bend wire. What is sometimes lost in the retelling of Betty's story is the detail that makes it scientifically, rather than merely anecdotally compelling. She repeated the solution reliably across multiple trials, using the same basic bending technique even when researchers varied the task slightly, which ruled out the possibility that the original wire bending had been a lucky accident produced by some unrelated motor behavior. A related line of research has examined New Caledonian crows' capacity for a specific kind of abstract physical reasoning, understanding water displacement well enough to solve variants of an Aesop's fable-style task, in which a crow must drop stones into a tube of water to raise the water level and bring a floating food reward within reach. Performance on these tasks among the best-performing crows has been compared directly in published research to the performance of children between roughly 5 and 7 years of age, confronted with conceptually equivalent problems, and the comparison has not consistently favored the children. The 2023 research that has generated the most significant recent discussion in the field takes the investigation of corvid cognition into territory that goes beyond tool use, memory, and social cognition into the domain of metacognition, the monitoring and regulation of one's own cognitive processes that sits at the foundation of human self-awareness, and that many researchers consider the defining cognitive characteristic of conscious mental life. It is worth noting that Nieder's group had already established a substantial body of related work before the 2023 results, having previously demonstrated that individual neurons in the crow's nidipallium caudolateral, a forebrain region functionally analogous to the mammalian prefrontal cortex, despite its entirely different anatomical organization, track abstract numerical quantity in a manner remarkably similar to number-selective neurons recorded in the primate prefrontal cortex. The researchers took considerable care to rule out the most obvious alternative explanation for this behavior, that the crows might simply apply a learned rule based on the objective difficulty of the stimulus category, declining whenever a stimulus fell into a category previously associated with poor performance without any genuine internal monitoring of subjective certainty at all. More significantly, the neural recording data collected simultaneously with the behavioral results showed that the crow's forebrain neurons showed activity patterns that correlated with the animal's subsequent confidence reports before those reports were made, meaning that the neural signature of the crow's internal uncertainty state was present in its brain activity before it expressed that uncertainty through its behavior. This is the neural signature of genuine metacognition, of a monitoring process running in parallel with the perceptual processing itself, and it was found in a structure, the avian pallium, that the older frameworks would have predicted was incapable of supporting such a process. What makes this finding genuinely disruptive rather than merely surprising is its implication for the relationship between brain structure and conscious awareness. If crows possess a functional analog of metacognitive self-monitoring, if there is something it is like to be a crow uncertain about a visual judgment, some internal experiential state that the crow is tracking and reporting, then consciousness, or at minimum the functional architecture that underlies human consciousness, is not the exclusive product of the specific neural structures that evolution happened to produce in the primate lineage. This notion of independently evolved convergent cognitive architecture has a name in the comparative cognition literature. Convergent cognitive evolution and corvids have become, alongside cetaceans and elephants, one of the field's central illustrative cases. The logic is by now familiar from the study of physical traits. Eyes evolved independently dozens of times because the basic problem a light-sensing organ solves is, one, many lineages encountered and many found workable solutions, two, despite entirely different starting materials, the ecological pressures generally believed to have driven this convergence in corvids are reasonably well understood, even if the precise weighting between them remains debated. Corvids are, almost without exception, highly social. Animals living in complex, long-term social groups in which individuals must track relationships and shifting alliances over years, the kind of social complexity that the social brain hypothesis identifies as a major driver of cognitive evolution in primates, and that appears to operate with comparable force in corvids. They're also, almost without exception, food-caching species, which imposes a strong selective premium on exactly the episodic memory and future-oriented planning the Scrub Jay studies documented. And many corvid species are remarkably opportunistic and behaviorally flexible foragers, capable of exploiting an unusually wide range of food sources and habitats, a generalist strategy that rewards exactly the kind of flexible, on-the-fly problem-solving the tool use experiments have documented. The broader implications of this understanding are ones that the scientific community is only beginning to work through in their full extent. The question of animal consciousness has historically been treated as a question that science could not productively address, too subjective, too dependent on first-person experience that resists third-person measurement, too prone to anthropomorphic projection and sentimental distortion. The practical and ethical dimensions of this shift are not trivial. How we treat animals, in agriculture, in research, in the management of wild populations, is grounded in assumptions about their capacity for subjective experience, for suffering, for awareness of their own condition. Those assumptions have historically been made on the basis of phylogenetic proximity to humans, with mammals generally afforded more moral consideration than birds, and birds more than fish or invertebrates, in a hierarchy that maps reasonably well onto the relative similarity of various animal nervous systems to our own. Some of these consequences are already visible in policy, even if unevenly. There's also a quieter cultural dimension to this shift. Crows occupy an unusually prominent place in human folklore across an enormous range of cultures. As tricksters, as omens, as messengers between the living and the dead, as figures of unsettling intelligence whose presence near human settlements has been remarked upon for as long as written records exist. It is tempting, and probably too neat, to suggest that this folkloric prominence reflects some pre-scientific intuitive recognition of the cognitive sophistication in the laboratory. Research has now documented with rigor anecdotal reports of this kind, crows that appear to recognize and specifically target individual researchers who have previously trapped or handled them, sometimes years after a single encounter, and sometimes communicating that recognition to other crows with no direct experience of the offending human, have circulated informally within the research community for decades. Recent controlled studies using realistic human face masks worn by researchers during capture events have substantiated the core of these reports, demonstrating that crows form lasting, generalizable associations between specific human facial features and the threat of capture, and that this learned wariness can persist for years and spread through a local crow population well beyond the individual birds with the original negative encounter. Whether that feeling of being recognized and assessed reflects genuine insight into the nature of corvid consciousness, or merely the human tendency toward anthropomorphic projection, is a question that the research has not yet fully resolved. But it has moved that question from the domain of sentiment into the domain of serious scientific inquiry, which is the only domain in which it was ever going to receive an answer grounded in something more reliable than intuition. And the answer, incomplete and contested as it currently remains, is already strange and significant enough to demand that we reconsider, with genuine seriousness, what we think we know about the minds of the animals we share the world with, and how little, it turns out, we have been paying attention. What seems most likely, based on the trajectory the field has followed over the past quarter century, is that the crow will not be the last species to force this kind of reconsideration. Each new line of corvid research has tended to follow the same basic pattern. A behavior is observed that seems too sophisticated to be plausible given prevailing assumptions. Skeptics propose simpler explanations. Those explanations are tested and eliminated through careful experimental design, and the field is left, somewhat reluctantly, to accept a conclusion that earlier consensus would have ruled out by definition. There is no obvious reason to expect this pattern to stop with metacognition, and ongoing research is already extending the same logic to corvid planning for future needs. The animal does not currently have corvid understanding of other individuals' false beliefs, and corvid capacity for the kind of recursive reasoning some theorists consider a hallmark of language-ready cognition, even in species that produce nothing resembling human language. Where that research will eventually lead is not yet clear. What is clear is that the bird brain, far from being a byword for stupidity, has turned out to be one of the most productive sites in contemporary science for discovering just how much more there is to discover about what a mind can be.